Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Monday, September 19th, 2022. The funeral service for Queen Elizabeth II in Great Britain, attended by President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden and other world leaders. Reuters describes it as a dazzling show of pomp and ceremony, and amid formality and careful choreography, moments of raw emotion. An American contractor held captive in Afghanistan for 2 years is set free in a prisoner swap with the Taliban for a convicted Afghan warlord and drug trafficker in U.S. custody. In Congress this week, U.S. House set to debate and vote on reforming the law that governs how electoral votes are counted, in an effort to prevent another January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. We'll talk about that with a reporter from The Hill. And among the bills in the U.S. Senate this week, one dealing with campaign finance, another on climate change, specifically limiting hydrofluorocarbons. We'll talk about that with a reporter from Bloomberg Government. Also get an update on the pending funding bill to keep the U.S. government from shutting down come October 1st, called the CR, or Continuing Resolution. And we start in Great Britain, the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, who died earlier this month after a reign of 70 years. Associated Press writes, before the service, a bell tolled 96 times, once a minute for each year of Elizabeth's life. Then 142 Royal Navy sailors used ropes to draw the gun carriage carrying the flag-draped coffin to Westminster Abbey, where pallbearers bore it inside, and about 2,000 people, ranging from world leaders to healthcare workers, gathered to mourn. The trappings of state and monarchy abounded. The coffin was draped with the royal standard, and atop it sat the imperial state crown, sparkling with almost 3,000 diamonds, and the sovereign's orb and scepter. Associated Press story going on, but the personal was also present. The coffin was followed into the church by generations of Elizabeth's descendants, including King Charles III, heir to the throne, Prince William, and 9-year-old George, who was second in line. On a wreath atop the coffin, a handwritten note read, "In loving and devoted memory," and was signed Charles R. for Rex, or King. During the service, the Prime Minister of Britain, Liz Truss, whom the Queen asked to form the new government just a few days before her death, read a verse from the Bible.
Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. And whither I go ye know, and the way ye know. Thomas saith unto him, Lord, we know not whither thou goest, and how can we know the way? Jesus saith unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father, but by me.
The British Prime Minister Liz Truss, reading from the book of John, the funeral service for Queen Elizabeth II today. It was held in Westminster Abbey, which was where the young princess was married in 1947 and coronated in 1953. Some of the world leaders present and not, according to reporting from the BBC and the Telegraph. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was invited, did not go. The Ukrainian First Lady in London instead. Some controversial invitees given to the President of China, Xi Jinping, and the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. Not invited, the leaders of Russia, Belarus, Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. And Nicaragua, North Korea, and Iran allowed to send ambassadors only. The sermon today given by the Reverend Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury.
The pattern for many leaders is to be exalted in life and forgotten after death. The pattern for all who serve God, famous or obscure, respected or ignored, is that death is the door to glory. Her late Majesty famously declared on a 21st birthday broadcast that her whole life would be dedicated to serving the nation and Commonwealth. Rarely has such a promise been so well kept. Few leaders receive the outpouring of love that we have seen. Jesus, who in our reading does not tell his disciples how to follow, but who to follow, said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Her late Majesty's example was not set through her position or her ambition, but through whom she followed. I know His Majesty shares the same faith and hope in Jesus Christ as his mother, the same sense of service and duty.
Reverend Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, part of the sermon today. He is the 105th Archbishop of Canterbury in British history, and that position is the senior bishop and a principal leader of the Church of England and the ceremonial head of the worldwide Anglican community. At the end of today's service in London, a rendition of the national anthem, the words changed to "God Save the King," in recognition of the new monarch. After the funeral service for the Queen at Westminster Abbey, casket was taken to Windsor Castle for the committal service and interment in St. George's Chapel. Reuters describing the toll the day took. Late in the day, they write, an ashen-faced King Charles held back tears while grief was etched on the faces of several members of the royal family. But there was this lighter note reporting from The Guardian. Queen Elizabeth II's staff lined the street outside Buckingham Palace to say farewell to the monarch after her funeral, and it wasn't just the humans of the royal household who were seen during Monday's ceremonies. The Queen's corgis and one of her ponies were led out to witness the procession at Windsor. As mentioned, President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden among the mourners at today's funeral. On Sunday, they paid their respects to Queen Elizabeth II, visiting her casket lying in state in London's Westminster Hall, and then signing condolence books at Lancaster House. President Biden speaking to the press for a few minutes after signing.
We've had an opportunity to meet with an awful lot of consequential people. But I can say that the ones who stand out in your mind are those whose relationship and interaction with you are consistent with their reputation. When the Queen had us to the castle for tea and we were joking crimpets, she kept offering me more. I kept eating everything she put in front of me. But she was the same in person as her image. Decent, honorable, and all about service. And our hearts go out to the royal family, King Charles and all the family. It's a loss that leaves a giant hole. And sometimes you think you'll never overcome it. But as I've told the King, she's going to be with him every step of the way, every minute, every moment. And that's a reassuring notion. So to all the people of England, all the people of the United Kingdom, our hearts go out to you, and you were fortunate to have had her for 70 years. We all were. The world's better for her. Thank you.
Mr. President, why does she remind you of your mother?
Just because the way she touched when she leaned over, the way she had that look like, are you okay? Anything I can do for you? What do you need? And then also make sure you do what you're supposed to do.
And what do you think she meant to the wider world beyond the UK, Mr. President?
Well, I think, look, the American press has heard me say for a long time, but I think the thing that is, maybe it's too much, excuse the expression, the Irish of it, but it's about treating people with dignity. I talk about how my mother and father thought that everyone, no matter who they were, no matter what their station, no matter where they're from, deserved to be treated with dignity. And that's exactly what she communicated. Just the way she walked by her staff, just the way she acted. And I think what she gave is a sense of, maybe above all, the notion of service. We all owe something. There's something within our capacity to do that can make things, not just the world better, but your neighborhood better, your household better, your workplace better. And that's what she communicated to me anyway. And it was an honor to meet her. An honor to meet her.
President Biden on Sunday, after he and First Lady Jill Biden signed condolence books for Queen Elizabeth II at Lancaster House in London ahead of the funeral today. All 5 living former U.S. presidents have been invited to a service of thanksgiving for the life of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II at Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. next week. The cathedral says it will be in partnership with the British Embassy. Those 5 living presidents, ex-presidents Donald Trump, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Jimmy Carter. Former President Obama tweeting today, "Mychael and I were lucky enough to know Her Majesty the Queen. Back when we were just beginning to navigate life as President and First Lady, she welcomed us to the world stage with extraordinary generosity. Our thoughts are with the royal family and those mourning her passing." Former President Obama including a video. Here's a portion of that.
The Queen was an excellent listener. She had a genuine curiosity, although she was impatient to get to the point. This is in 2011, and we'd been invited to a state dinner at Buckingham Palace. State dinners at Buckingham Palace, a little different than state dinners everywhere else. The Queen was dressed up quite a bit for this state dinner, and it was a little bit concerning for Mychael because as a gift to Her Majesty, Mychael had selected a small, modest brooch of nominal value. We reciprocated the following evening with a dinner that we hosted at the American Embassy. But the one thing we immediately notice is that she's wearing the brooch that Mychael had given. And it was an example of the subtle thoughtfulness that she consistently displayed, not just to us, but to everybody who she interacted with. She was very mindful of guests at Buckingham Palace not overstaying their welcome. She was looking at her watch and at some point said, "Well, okay, it's time to go." And the same was true as a guest. She wasn't interested in overstaying her welcome. She looked at her watch at a certain point and said, "All right, I think we need to wrap this up." The combination of a sense of duty and a clear understanding of her role as a symbol for a nation and as the carrier of a certain set of values, combined with a very human quality of kindness and consideration. I think that's what made her so beloved, not just in Great Britain, but around the world.
A portion of the video tweeted by former President Barack Obama on today, the funeral day of Queen Elizabeth II. And the funeral was truly a global affair. Washington Post has a story. The Bermuda Musical and Dramatic Society has screened royal weddings. The community theater here in the capital of Britain's oldest overseas territory has celebrated Queen Elizabeth II's Jubilee, including her Platinum Jubilee in June, marking her 70 years on the throne. And so on Monday, about 24 of its members convened before sunrise over bacon sandwiches and mimosas around a bar in the Daylesford Theatre, kitted out with Union Jack flags to toast to Her Majesty on the more somber occasion of her funeral. That from the Washington Post. And you're listening to Washington Today. President Biden today announcing the release of a U.S. hostage, a civilian contractor abducted in Kabul, Afghanistan over 2 years ago. President's statement reads, "Bringing the negotiations that led to Mark's freedom to a successful resolution required difficult decisions, which I did not take lightly. Our priority now is to make sure Mark receives a healthy and safe return and is given the space and time he needs to transition back into society. My administration continues to prioritize the safe return of all Americans who are held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad, and we will not stop until they are reunited with their families. That statement from President Biden. President Biden did not mention specifically an exchange of Fredericks for an Afghan in U.S. prison, Bashir Noorzai, who's been in U.S. custody for 17 years after a conviction for drug trafficking and reportedly has ties to the Taliban. Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaking about this during a visit to New York City today. He's there for this week's United Nations General Assembly.
Before we begin, let me just take a moment to again welcome the safe return of Mark Fredericks, an American Navy, a veteran who spent more than 2.5 years in captivity in Afghanistan. His return is the culmination of many, many months of tireless and effective work by so many colleagues in our government. I especially want to extend thanks to our special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, Roger Carstens, who's actually with Mark as we speak, and to our special representative for Afghanistan, Tom West. Many national security professionals across the government gave their all to this effort to get Mark out of captivity and ultimately to bring him home. And I want to thank all the people who've worked on this over these many months, who care about Mark, and we're profoundly grateful to them. The support that we received from our Qatari partners as well was key in securing his release. Mark's soon going to be reunited with his family. The President had an opportunity to speak to them a few hours ago. I want the families of Americans who are being arbitrarily detained or held hostage anywhere in the world to know that our commitment to them, to bringing their loved ones home, is resolute, and we will relentlessly continue to focus on doing just that. We'll bring the same determination and focus to those efforts as we brought to the effort to bring Mark Fredericks out of captivity and home to his loved ones. For the United States, for me personally, there is no higher priority than bringing Americans who are being arbitrarily and unjustly detained or held hostage back home to freedom, to their families. We'll continue to work this relentlessly and secure the release of all Americans who are being unjustly held wherever that's the case. We mean what we say. Mark's family had my word. Every other family has my word as well.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken in New York City today. It was the start of an unrelated event in the lead up to this week's UN General Assembly. A USA Today article has this: the sister of Mark Fredericks, who is from Lombard, Illinois, thanked U.S. government officials who helped secure her brother's release. I'm so happy to hear that my brother is safe and on his way home to us. Our family has prayed for this each day of the more than 31 months he has been a hostage. We never gave up hope that he would survive and come home safely to us. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Live Tuesday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time on C-SPAN Radio. A Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Subcommittee hearing titled Uncounted Deaths in America's Prisons and Jails, How the Department of Justice Failed to Implement the Death in Custody Reporting Act. Testifying will be relatives of prisoners who died and a Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Senate hearing on uncounted deaths in prisons and jails, Tuesday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time on C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which is available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. Two members of the House Select Committee that is investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, one Republican, one Democrat, introducing a bill they say would help prevent another such attack. It would reform the 135-year-old law that governs how electoral votes are counted. We'll get some details on the bill they introduced and the House debate and votes this week coming up in a moment with a reporter. But first, former President Donald Trump campaigning for Ohio Senate Republican nominee J.D. Vance on Saturday in Youngstown, Ohio, again claiming that his re-election loss in 2020 and other Republican losses are due to election fraud. Former President Donald Trump in Youngstown, Ohio on Saturday, a rally for J.D. Vance, the Republican nominee for U.S. Senate. The House of Representatives scheduled to take up a bill that reforms the Electoral Count Act from 1887, dealing with how electoral votes are cast and counted. Two members of the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol filing a bill today. Joining us now to talk about it is Mychael Schnell, congressional reporter with The Hill. Thank you so much. Who are the members and what is in the bill?
So this is from Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, a Democrat from California, and Congresswoman Liz Cheney, Republican from Wyoming. And their bill, which has been highly anticipated for months since the January 6th Select Committee started their work, is called the Presidential Election Reform Act. This bill hinges on four main concepts, and what the two lawmakers are dubbing it is it's a way to reform the 1887 Electoral Count Act, which outlines how electoral votes are counted and cast for presidential elections. And they say this will prevent another January 6th from occurring. So like I mentioned, four main concepts here. First off, it clarifies that the vice president's role in counting electoral votes on January 6th is strictly ceremonial and a ministerial role. This increases the requirement for objecting to a slate of electors. So that's when we saw on January 6th, House members and senators objecting to slates of electors from specific states. Previously, just one House member and one senator was required to object, but in the Cheney-Lofgren bill, it would require 1/3 of each chamber. So a pretty significant increase there. Third, this bill gives governors the authority to transmit election results by a certain date. And if a governor does not abide by that or inaccurate certificates are sent, it actually gives candidates the ability to obtain a court order that would require the governor to transmit the state's lawful certificate. And if the governor then refuses, another official can do the work. And the fourth tenet we have here is it rules that rules for governing an election cannot change after the election happened. You can't retroactively change the rules for how elections occur and how votes are cast. So those are the four main tenets for the Presidential Election Reform Act, Congresswoman Cheney and Lofgren, to reform the Electoral Count Act.
The House is going to be taking up this week. Is the House Democratic leadership behind this, and what are the Republicans saying?
House Democratic leadership is behind this. Like mentioned, this bill has been highly anticipated. There have actually been a couple other pushes to reform the Electoral Count Act. A group of bipartisan senators introduced a bill on their side of the Capitol over the summer. and a bipartisan group of lawmakers introduced a companion bill last week. So now this Presidential Election Reform Act from Cheney and Lofgren, that'll then go to conference with the Senate bill. So then Senates from both can be put together and have one bill that could then pass through Congress. I will note the two bills are pretty similar. One difference is that, as I mentioned, it raises the threshold to object to a state's electors. The Senate bill only requires a 1/5, so 20% of each chamber to agree to object. The Cheney-Lofgren bill requires a third. In terms of bipartisan support, all the bills on this subject that have been introduced have been on a bipartisan basis. The Lofgren-Cheney bill was the text was just released within the past hour, so it still remains to be seen how the wide array of Republicans will embrace it, but it will for sure have bipartisan support, even if it's just a little bit.
We're talking with Mychael Schnell from The Hill. What are the chances this would be done before the current November elections?
I think the chances look fairly strong right now. The House Rules Committee is set to meet on the bill tomorrow. Once a rule is established, it can then hit the floor as soon as Wednesday. It appears that leadership and especially the sponsors want to move quickly on this. Then it'll go to the Senate. In terms of timing, because the calendar is really what matters in the few weeks before an election. The House is in session this week, and the House and Senate are in session this week, and they're both in session next week. Though it is a short week for the Rosh Hashanah holiday in the beginning of the week, so there is time for this to go through. It'll surely pass the House, it looks like. Whether it makes it through the Senate by the end of the legislative session remains to be seen. But it looks like it's pretty confident that it looks like it'll make it through the House this week.
And finally, this is, as you mentioned, the highest profile reform that's coming out of the January 6th committee hearings. But are there other reform efforts that have been pushed that at this point may be at the early stages?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, this was sort of the marquee piece of legislative proposal that the committee has looked at. In the committee's founding charter, it says that one of its responsibilities is to create these proposals to prevent a January 6th from ever occurring again. So reforming the Electoral Count Act was number one on the list, but they're also looking at other reforms, one of them being increasing penalties for specific offenses. So it's pretty sure to say that we will be seeing more reforms be released in the coming weeks, especially before the election and then before January when Republicans are likely to take control of the House and then dissolve the committee. So while this was the marquee piece of legislation, the marquee proposal from the committee, it's pretty certain to say that there will be more legislative recommendations coming.
Mychael Schnell is a congressional reporter with The Hill. Stories at thehill.com, and on Twitter, it's Mychael Schnell, Mychael. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
U.S. Senate this week also working on a bill that deals with elections. Senator Chuck Schumer, Majority Leader, speaking about it on the Senate floor.
Madam President, today I'm announcing the Senate will vote this week to take up a measure critical to fighting the cancer of dark money in our elections, the Disclose Act. I've long promised to bring this bill to the floor, and I want to thank all my colleagues, and in particular Senator Whitehouse. He has done an amazing job documenting and pressing forward on trying to eliminate the evil scourge of dark money. He has been an amazing leader in championing this legislation. The Disclose Act is premised on a simple idea. Americans deserve to know who is trying to influence their elections. Sadly, most Americans today are largely in the dark, thanks to the abominable decision in Citizens United handed down by the Supreme Court's conservative majority. Their ruling has paved the way for billions in unlimited campaign contributions by super PACs and other dark money groups over the last decade. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, have had their voices drowned out by elites who have millions to spare for political donations. And the worst part, much of this spending happens entirely in secret. That's not like a democracy. It is a veil cast over our democracy that must be ripped away once and for all. The Disclose Act is simple. It would require super PACs and other dark money groups to report anyone contributing $10,000 or more during an election. It would likewise require groups spending money on judicial nominees to disclose their donors too. There's no justification under heaven for keeping such massive contributions hidden from the public.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor. With a closer look at what Congress is doing this week, we're joined by Emily Wilkins, a Congress reporter with Bloomberg Government. Thank you very much. Let's start with the Senate. What's on the agenda?
The Senate's got a couple of very interesting measures that are being teed up this week. Of course, they are continuing to do various nominations for positions for federal judges. They're working right now to fill the spot on the U.S. Court of Appeals that was left by Ketanji Brown Jackson when, of course, she was nominated to the Supreme Court. But they've also got a couple really interesting bills that they are working to tee up this week. One, it deals with the transparency of campaign money and donations. It's a Democratic-backed proposal. It's called the Disclose Act. And basically, it would require that any of these political action committees or 501c4 nonprofit groups that give massive amounts of money without disclosing their donors would need to at least tell folks, donors who give more than $10,000 during an election cycle. They've tried to bring this up before. Republicans have blocked it, but Democrats are hoping that even if they bring up this vote and it doesn't go through, they can at least sort of point to Republicans who voted against it and use this on the campaign trail. They're also looking at a climate change amendment. It calls for scaling down hydrofluorocarbons, chemicals found in the air and refrigeration that can contribute to climate change. This is something that Congress has been working on reducing for a while, as well as the EPA. And this is just kind of a general effort that really ties more into what the U.S. is trying to do to help combat climate change.
The continuing resolution to keep the government funded is also sort of hanging out there, probably not going to be completed this week, but there's a lot of talk about the deal that Senator Schumer made with Senator Manchin regarding energy permitting reform. Do we have any updates on that?
So at this point, that is the big question. The CR is the one thing they have to get done, and the permitting reform seems to be, at this point, the biggest thing standing in its way, because you have a number of Democrats who have raised concerns about saying, we don't want to do things that are going to help the fossil fuel industry. However, it's been interesting because I and others on the Hill, we've asked, some of the Democrats who are sort of most pro-environment, green energy, if this permitting reform is included, would you not vote for the bill to temporarily fund the government? And so far, no one's been willing to say that to us. Everyone said, well, we need to see the text of this permitting reform deal. We need to get an idea of exactly what is involved, and only then will I decide, which kind of says to me that, a lot of these lawmakers, particularly Democrats, they don't want to shut the government down right before a really key midterm. It's important for them to be seen as a functional party that's governing Washington. And they also, if they shut down the government, that means that they are going to have to stick around for part of the month of October. Right now, the House lawmakers, at least, are planning on leaving after September 30th, and they will be gone till the midterms. That's really critical time for some of them to be back in their districts campaigning. And so while I think there are some concerns being raised, and we'll see how exactly far this goes, there's also some hesitation among those who have been the most outspoken to actually say that they'll vote to not fund the government just because of permitting reform.
We're talking with Emily Wilkins with Bloomberg Government. Over to the House, we just spoke a few moments ago about the Electoral Count Act reform that's coming up. Any other bills catching your attention?
So the Electoral Count Act reform is really the big one this week. But there's another very interesting one that deals with student loans. There was this federal program that existed where if you got married to someone and said, hey, we want to combine our loans into one, you could go ahead and do that. While that program ended, they never gave couples a way to get out of doing that. So if you divorced or you separated, you said, hey, I just want to have my own loans now and not be tied with this other person, there was no way to separate that. This is what this legislation would do. It's got a lot of support from both sides of the aisle. And it's coming, of course, at a time where President Biden has announced that he will be forgiving up to $10,000 of federal student loans, $20,000 if you were a student who had a low income and then therefore qualified for a Pell Grant. And so this might be something where if you've had your loans tied up and you might want to free them up, because once again, this loan forgiveness, it's not going to apply to everyone. It's going to be there's a salary cap on it. And so it really might make sense for someone to try and separate their loans that have been previously combined. And that's one of the things the House is working on this week. Of course, we're keeping an eye on things such as a stock ban, a ban on lawmakers trading stocks. You heard House Speaker Nancy Pelosi mention the other week that that's something she thought could be done by the end of the month. And we're also keeping an eye on any potential policing or public service bills. We know that's also something that lawmakers are working on. But right now, really, the big fish is the continuing resolution. That is the one thing that lawmakers need to do before the end of the month.
And one more bill just came to my mind, the National Defense Authorization Act.
The NDAA, the ever important. I mean, at this point, it does seem that is going to be one of a number of things that are being bumped at this point into the lame duck. Certainly, there is a number of very important pieces of legislation that are going to be addressed post the midterm elections. I think it really speaks, number one, to kind of the environment right now in Congress. It's been a little more difficult to get things done on time and on schedule. And it also kind of speaks to the fact that a lot of lawmakers, both Democrats and Republicans, are itching to get out on the campaign trail. They know that this election, particularly in the Senate, it could go either way. In the House, Democrats have gained some momentum. And I think everyone, a lot of folks want to be back in their districts right now talking with their constituents.
Emily Wilkins with Bloomberg Government, a Congress reporter at Bloomberg.com and on Twitter at EMR Wilkins. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell opening the Senate this week by talking on the floor about the economy, and he referenced what President Joe Biden said Sunday night in an interview on the CBS News program 60 Minutes.
Last week, the American people received yet another absolutely crushing inflation report. More than a year after Washington Democrat policy set off the worst overall inflation in 40 years, the prices of some of the most essential items for working families are skyrocketing at their fastest rates in a generation. Electricity costs are rising faster than they have since 1981. And grocery inflation has eclipsed a high from 1979. Parents trying to put food on the table are now contending with annual price hikes of 16.2% for a loaf of bread, 17% for a gallon of milk, and 40% more for a dozen eggs. Now, the very same day this painful news broke, just a few hours later, Washington Democrats threw a party for themselves on the White House lawn to celebrate their economic policies. You really can't make this stuff up. The official numbers had just confirmed that American families have seen the single worst year for both food and electricity inflation since the fallout from Jimmy Carter. And the Democrats' response was to throw themselves a party for spending hundreds of billions of dollars more, raising taxes, and making working-class Americans pay off the loans of doctors and lawyers. You might think the Biden administration couldn't possibly get any more out of touch. You'd think that kind of display would have to take the cake. But alas, Madam President, last night on 60 Minutes, President Biden gave an almost comically out-of-touch interview on the inflation crisis. The president argued with a straight face that the American people ought to be grateful for last month's terrible inflation report because it could have been even worse. Here was the quote. Guess where we are? We're in a position where in the last several months inflation hasn't spiked. Struggling Americans are supposed to be grateful that we have plateaued at a steady ongoing inflation rate of more than 8%. President wants a round of applause for steadily clocking month after month after month of the worst inflation in 40 years. The inflation rate plateauing does not mean that prices themselves have leveled off. It means prices are still steadily climbing all the time at an historically fast pace, the worst in a generation.
The Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, today on the Senate floor. On Wall Street, the Dow up 197, NASDAQ up 86, S&P up 26. The governor of Puerto Rico, Pedro Pierluisi, says that Hurricane Fiona has caused catastrophic destruction in the entire U.S. territory, losing electricity, many people with no running water. He said perhaps billions of dollars in damage, over 1,000 people rescued so far by emergency crews. Rain continues to fall. The island's National Weather Service office saying that flash flooding was happening in the south central parts of Puerto Rico and tweeting, "Move to higher ground immediately." The governor held a news conference today with other emergency officials.
What are the areas that you're focusing your rescue efforts now? And what are the areas that are most affected in terms of flooding and rescue efforts?
The areas most affected are the ones in the south and southwest of Puerto Rico, as well as the mountain range, central mountain range in Puerto Rico. But we anticipate that there will be areas impacted as well on the northern coast of Puerto Rico because of the water flow coming down the rivers and the mountainside. Salinas is a town in the south of Puerto Rico where there was a big rescue operation because of flooding in the area. But unfortunately so, I have to say that the hurricane and now the storm, the related storm, has covered the whole island and has impacted the whole island. So we're still in the middle of this event. We're basically responding at this point. The next step will be recovery. We're not there yet.
Governor of Puerto Rico, Pedro Pierluisi, at a news conference today in Puerto Rico. Back in Washington, D.C., this from the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor.
Now, today, my thoughts are with all our fellow Americans in Puerto Rico and all communities across the Caribbean, battered by the destruction of Hurricane Fiona. As of this morning, well over 1 million residents on the island remain without power, and 2/3 remain without running water. Later today, I will get on the phone, in a short while, I will get on the phone with the FEMA administrator and urge that they be ready to approve temporary 100% federal cost share for all emergency protective services that Puerto Rico conducts in the coming days. That means covering the island's costs for distributing food and water, disaster operations, emergency medical care. Right now, the FEMA Disaster Relief Fund has about $15 billion as of late last week, a fund we Democrats fought extremely hard to secure. I will also join with my colleagues in the New York delegation to send FEMA a letter calling on them to be ready to support Puerto Rico on any upcoming requests for aid. 5 years, almost exactly 5 years to the day, after Puerto Rico was devastated by Hurricane Maria, the federal government has a responsibility to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the previous administration. The federal response should be swift, robust, and continue for as long as the island needs.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer today on the Senate floor in Washington. Hurricane Fiona now moving on to the Dominican Republic. CNN reporting the storm knocking out 59 aqueducts, with several others partially functioning, leaving more than 1 million customers there without running water. Hurricane Fiona expected to strengthen as it moves into the Atlantic Ocean, and the National Weather Service is warning anyone visiting East Coast mainland United States beaches to be aware of potentially dangerous tide conditions. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Get more of Washington's top stories sent to you every day. Subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word. Sign up at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.